The Aliyah of Israel today is a modern miracle. Against all odds, our people came up from the graves of the Holocaust to this very land. In one day, a nation was born, and Jewish people from around the world began returning to their historic homeland. But is the rebirth of our nation just a testimony of grit and good luck, or are we part of a much greater story? What does modern Israel have to do with the biblical Aliyah of Ezra and Nehemiah over 2,400 years ago?
Most Israelis know quite well about the formation of Israel from school and their training in the IDF, but many are unaware of the echoes of our biblical past in our present day and what it means for the Jewish people.
In this episode, we're going to look at what the scriptures have to say about the rebirth of the state of Israel and the incredible parallels hidden in our past and present, and seek to answer the questions. Does national Israel exist purely by chance, or a historical error as some claim? Or is it by divine providence and as part of God's plan for all mankind? And if God truly established our return, what's next?
In Ezekiel 37, the prophet declares, "Surely I will take the children of Israel from among the nations, wherever they have gone, and will gather them from every side and bring them into their own land."
One of the most famous Jewish commentators of all times, who lived 700 years ago, noticed a repeating trend in Scripture and thus coined a well-known term to describe it. The acts of the fathers is the sign for the sons. Simply put, God has written history together in a way that as we look to the events of the past, we can learn of our present and of our future. Many times in Scripture, we see past events foreshadowing events to come, prophesizing God's deliverance and judgment.
Let's start by looking back to the timing of some key events in biblical history during the time of the prophet Jeremiah. The people of Judah lost their sovereignty as a nation when Nebuchadnezzar came up to the land and put King Jehoiakim and Judah under servitude around 605 BC.
After a failed rebellion in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar installed his own vassal king, but peace didn't last long. The Jewish people rebelled against Babylon, and Jerusalem was besieged. In 586 BC, 19 years after the first conquest, Jerusalem was completely destroyed.
Fast forward 70 years, it was Cyrus that issued the decree to rebuild the temple and send our people home. Our people were once again a nation, but only a few actually went back to Jerusalem. While the altar was built, very few people lived in the city since it wasn't secure, and our people were in peril from our neighbors.
100 years after Cyrus made his declaration, hope was restored, and Nehemiah was commissioned by the Persian king to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. It took 52 days full of threats and terror from Israel's enemies, but under Nehemiah's leadership, the wall was built, and Jerusalem was safely in Jewish hands.
Now let's take a look at our modern era. After Israel was established as a nation in 1948, the Jewish people had a sovereign state once again, but Jerusalem was divided, and the Old City and Western Wall were occupied by Jordan. 19 years later, after the miraculous Six-Day War of 1967, Jerusalem was once again, after 2,000 years, back in Jewish hands.
Note the parallels. First, the nation's sovereignty. Then, Jerusalem secured. Is this all by accident? Or has God repeated this pattern of events to show us something important? Now let's explore the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and see if we can find even more parallels between the Babylonian Aliyah and the modern Aliyah of our day.
First, Let's remember the context of the Babylonian exile. Jerusalem was utterly destroyed and millions of lives were lost in the conquests and exile that ravaged our land. Our people were scattered by our conquerors and all hope seemed to be lost. But 70 years into exile, without a war or political alliance, a miracle happened. The remnant of an enslaved and conquered people were granted their freedom. Isaiah prophesied of this event, and we can see the foreshadowing of this prophecy not just for Ezra's generation, but ours as well.
Who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall the earth be made to give birth in one day? Or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion was in labor, she gave birth to her children.
Many who read these verses today see the miracle of our nation's birth. But it was very similar in the day of Ezra. Nobody was looking after the welfare of the Jewish people. It wasn't in the interest of those in power to restore a Jewish homeland. But in just one day, Cyrus made a decree and it was done. In the same way, our nation came forth against all political odds, a remnant from the World War and the horrors of the Holocaust. Thus, our people returned to the land of promise.
The Holocaust of our age wasn't the only time our people were nearly extinguished. Millions of lives were lost in the wars and Babylonian conquest, only a remnant remained. It was out of the ashes of this dark age that we see Psalm 137's cry, often recited by our people in our darkest hours. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept, when we remembered Zion. Through that psalm, we gain a glimpse at the grief and the brutality of their destruction, and the same ancient hope that our fathers held to return back to Zion once again.
Despite international sentiments and proclamations to establish a Jewish home for the Jewish people before World War II, these promises did not materialize. Before, and to some degree also after World War II, the British Empire worked to keep Jewish people away from returning to their ancestral homeland. They needed to gain favor with the Arab countries and keep their access to oil-rich territory. The British needed the allegiance of these Arab nations to secure vital oil trade. They saw little benefit to establishing Israel, which would enrage their prospective allies. During World War II, the British even prevented those trying to escape the Holocaust from reaching Israel's shores.
But despite the opposition, in just one day in 1948, a nation was formed. All of President Truman's advisors counseled that the US vote against establishing the Jewish state in the coming UN's League of Nations vote. In fact, even Truman himself seemed opposed up until the last second. But at the last moment, he made the official recognition of the Jewish state, shocking his own generals and diplomats. Later, at a banquet, when Truman was being introduced as the man who helped create the State of Israel, Truman interrupted the presenter and said, "What do you mean help to create? I am Cyrus."
Many commentators state that Truman arguably played the decisive diplomatic role in the birth of the new State of Israel. But it wasn't a perfect alliance. Truman may have been quick to recognize Israel, but in the same stroke, he laid an arms embargo on the Middle East, forcing Israel to scavenge for weapons to survive.
An alliance between a Judeo-Christian democracy like the United States could potentially be explained by politics. It's possible that Truman was just courting the Christian and Jewish vote, but the story many never hear is the other Cyrus, the most unlikely ally of Israel, Joseph Stalin.
Stalin may have presided over some of the worst persecution of the Jewish people in history. But in 1947, as the debate of Israel's future raged, it was Russia's leadership that shocked Jewish diplomats and the world. They supported the Jewish state not just through UN resolutions, but approving arms deals, which helped secure weapons crucial to Israel's defense in the War of Independence. While there are various theories as to why the Russians shifted their stance on Israel, Stalin's decision is still shrouded in mystery.
Abba Evan later recalled, "Nothing had prepared us for this windfall." Moscow was reversing its traditional posture by proposing the option of a Jewish state. I had come to the United Nations with a pessimistic assumption about the balance of forces. I now revised my predictions. For the first time, our political sky was lit up with a gleam of hope. It was no longer necessary to be a romantic optimist in order to foresee a Zionist success. Gromyko had become a Zionist hero.
And unlike the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, when we could be in the land but not rule it, we finally became a sovereign nation once again in 1948. But the story continues. Just as both foreign kings helped to fund the restoration of Jerusalem and the Temple, we see that since 1948 until today, God has moved some nations, most notably the United States, to provide hundreds of billions of dollars in aid.
We could go on and on about unlikely alliances and amazing last-minute diplomatic and military victories, which shock the world time and time again. But looking at the facts, you have to ask yourselves, are we just lucky? Was all this due to our own skill and intellect? Or do we have to admit that God has divinely and sovereignly set up the nation of Israel and brought us back for even greater things to come?
The odds were always against us. And just like in Ezra and Nehemiah's day, many times our future looked grim. But then God, in His perfect timing, just as predicted thousands of years ago by the prophets of old, orchestrated an amazing story and made the impossible possible.
Ezra and Nehemiah walked in miracles and overcame impossible odds because they kept their eyes fixed on God's promises in the midst of impossible situations. They read the promises of the prophets, and their belief helped them stand and lead our people to victory and closer to God. And likewise, we have the same opportunity as the prophets have more to say about the nation we live in today. Will we cower to the odds in fear, or stand in faith looking to God's promises?
The parallels continue in our next episode. We will dig into the similarities of Israel's enemies in the story of Nehemiah and the Aliyah of today.